Welcome to another episode of Silk and Steel podcast. This is going to be a new episode that's a supplement to the new Chinese history podcast I just started. For this purpose, I invited an expert on population genetics, Mr. Razib Khan. Welcome to the show, Razib.
Hey, how's it going, Carl? It's great to be on.
Thank you. I had a great pleasure guesting on your show, the Brown Pundit podcast, which I do recommend people to check out, especially for people who are interested in South Asian related issues.
Mm-hmm.
And Razib is also you can probably do a better job introduce yourself, Razib. So why don't you go?
Sure. So, as Carl, implied, I run a blog called Brown Pundits, and I have a podcast called The Browncast. Associated with that, I also run a blog called Gene Expression. And for my day job, I also have a podcast called The Insight, which is on genetics and evolution. My interests are population and evolutionary genetics, but I'm also fascinated with history, ethnography, geography, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's probably why I'm on this podcast, because I am interested in Chinese history, and I do know a fair amount about population genetics and the genetics of China.
Yes, so please check out Razib's blog post and his podcast. I will put the links in the show notes. So without further ado, let's get into some ancient and modern Chinese genetics.
Mm-hmm. So do you wanna ask a question, or you want me to just start what we know in the broad sketch?
Yeah. So you sent me the very scholarly notes on the Chinese population genetics. If you can just put it in layman's term for the rest of us, and just give us a very broad general outline and sketch. So just assume everybody's novice, right?
Yeah, sure. So, population genetics, as the term implies, is the genetics of populations. And obviously China has a large population. Over 90%, probably around 95% are ethnic Han Chinese, which is obviously defined by the language, whichever Chinese dialect they speak, and their self-identity. In the last 5 years or so, because of the rise of genomics and genetic technologies in China, Beijing Genomics Institute has been really big, for example. There has been a fair amount of work on modern Chinese. And so we can test questions that we have. So, for example, is it true, as some people have asserted, that the Cantonese are genetically like the Vietnamese as opposed to the people of the Yellow River Plain, like, say, someone from Shandong? Or, other people have asserted that there's a huge difference between people in the east and the west of China proper, from Sichuan to Zhejiang on the coast. And I apologize for my pronunciations. My kids are learning Chinese, and they always laugh at my pronunciations, but just go with that. So in terms of these questions, I will say, what we know about the modern Han Chinese is, as a population geneticist and as someone with an interest in Chinese history, I was surprised at how homogeneous they are, how much the Chinese of the north, the south, the east, and the west, the Han Chinese, are similar. And this indicates that they have been intermarrying and the populations have been mixing with each other for a long time, which kind of makes sense because Chinese don't really have a caste system. Different clan groups intermarry with each other and whatnot. If you look at the genetic variation in China, it's very similar in a way to Europe in terms of most of the variation being dictated by geography. So people further away from each other are genetically more distant. And so people in the north of China are more similar to people in the north of China, people in the south of China more similar to people in the south of China, and east and west, so forth, right? One thing that is maybe a little less intuitive, though, is that more of the variation is actually north-south than east-west. In fact, it is, I'm doing the math quick in my head, it's about 5 times more variation between north-south than east to west. So what I'm trying to get at is, if you go from Shanghai to Sichuan, it's going to be a lot less genetic variation, a lot less genetic distance than if you go from, say, I don't know, Beijing to Guangdong. Okay, so most of the Chinese difference is north-south, not east-to-west. We could posit historical reasons. For example, during the downfall of the Ming Dynasty and the rise of the Manchus, Sichuan was highly depopulated. It was resettled from Hunan. I mean, that's one of the things that people have noticed. And so it could be that gene flow east-west is, due to settlement after famine. They tended not to go south or north because people in the different latitudes, they cultivate different crops. They don't have the skills. People east-west, though, they cultivate similar crops. So that could be a hypothesis that explains that. Another issue is the Han Chinese in Guangdong are, as I said, more similar to the Han Chinese, or no, I didn't say that, but it was a question that I was asking, are more similar to the Han Chinese in North China than they are to the Vietnamese. Now, if you model it, you can see that the people in Guangdong are more similar to the Vietnamese. So there looks like to be detectable mixture with local substrate. That's just a way of saying that some of the ancestors of the Han Chinese in the south were not Han Chinese. They were probably Dai people, Vietnamese, Proto-Vietnamese people, Yay people, like various other non-Han groups. And non-Han groups were flourishing as far north as the Yangtze River Valley in historical times, like before the rise of the Qin Dynasty, for example. Those Chinese polities in the Yangtze River Valley were semi-Chinese, right? So we know that people assimilate to Chinese identity, but there's also a genetic coherency. Now, when you go to the north of China, one of the interesting things that I have always noticed when I look at North Chinese genetic characteristics is they are shifted towards West Eurasians. Say like 1 to 5%, depending on the individual, depending on where they are from, they're shifted towards the people from, Central Asia, Europe, towards the West, Western people, as they would say in China, right? And so you don't see any of that in the South. So like, where does that come from? These are questions that need to be asked. So you see these like subtle differences that are consistent that you could associate with particular historical patterns. But the broad general scope for the contemporary Chinese is actually they're relatively coherent. The genetic variation among the Han Chinese is in the range of what you would see among Northern Europeans. So like the difference between a Dutch person and someone from Poland is pretty equivalent to what you would see from North Chinese versus Central Chinese province, something like that. So you can think of Chinese as Northern Europeans in terms of how they relate to each other genetically. There's subtle differences which people in China and outside of China notice, but they're actually relatively similar. And then most of the genetic variation is north-south. It's not east-west. So, that's what I would say about the contemporary stuff. And so, I don't know if you have any questions on that, Carl. I can go to the ancient stuff, but yeah.
So I expected the north-south differentiation. For a long time, people actually postulated that the North and South Chinese came from different source population. One reason is historically, China actually have at least 2 cradles of civilization. There's a Yellow River Basin in the north and the Yangtze River Valley in the south. And in fact, the agriculture was first developed in the Yangtze River Valley when rice was first independently cultivated about 9,000 years ago. And so we know that the 2 river valleys always hosted dense populations since ancient times. And we also know historically there was a push from the north to the south. There's population migration, where the ancestor of Han Chinese traditionally in the traditional historiography is considered to come from, the Yellow River Basin. And as you mentioned earlier, the push into Yangtze River Valley only happened on a big scale around just little over 2,000 years ago. And also maybe a little bit of a history on the testing for genetics. So in the now we have the full access to the human genome, right? Like we can test every part of the human DNA, but back in the old days, which is not that long ago, I remember initially was really just studying the sex chromosomes, right? The Y haplogroup, basically the Y chromosome that's only passed from the father to sons, and the mitochondria DNA that's only passed from the mother to daughters. So when I was growing up in China, I learned that through genetic testing of sex chromosomes, there was there was difference and similarities among Chinese population. The similarity is that in terms of male dominated, not dominated, but male sex chromosome Y haplogroups, the distribution is relatively uniform all across China, from north to south. So there's a patrilineage that's shared all across China, but the mitochondria DNA that's passed from mother to daughter, it's very different from the north to south. So in the northern China plains to versus like the Yangtze River Valley, the mitochondria DNA has been pretty stable in these populations since like the ancient times, since the Neolithic times. So what it looks like was, these kind of male mediated migration from the north to south, and whereas the Han Chinese from the northern China plain just move into say the Yangtze River Valley and further south into the Pearl River Valley around Guangdong, and they married local indigenous women and such produce the offspring. So my expectation has always been there will be a big difference between the northern and the southern Chinese, because at least I thought, but to my surprise is that I had expected in the south, the southern Chinese would have a lot more indigenous DNA component. But from what you're saying is that's actually not true. It's overall it's pretty uniform.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to rerun the numbers, but off the top of my head, I think that the typical Cantonese, you can model them, and this isn't real. This is just a model, but you can model them as 75% Northern Han and 25% Vietnamese. So, I mean, they're obviously shifted towards the Vietnamese, right? But they're still not that far from the Northern Han. And so here's one thing that I would say about the mtDNA and the Y. You're roughly correct. I think one way you could explain this is imagine a scenario where southern China, and like when I say southern, let's say talk south of the Yangtze, like we know that like the Pearl River Delta and Fujian were, settled in in the last 2,000 years. You have soldiers and officials coming down south. They take local women, right? They have offspring. The offspring are identified and raised as Han, albeit with some indigenous characteristics, which can be seen in Cantonese culture, for example. They trace it to some of the tribal people that were there before. But now imagine that there's a new generation of soldiers and bureaucrats coming down from the north. Well, I mean, they need to have wives, and where are they going to get the wives from? Well, I mean, these women that are the daughters of the men that had come the previous generation. So you can have a succession of migrations where the whole genome becomes much more Han as people from the north keep migrating, but the mitochondrial DNA remains indigenous. Does that make sense? And so, I mean, that...
Yes, it does, but I'm still thinking, like, say, in case of Mexico, right? I mean, we know, like, Mexico had experienced these male-mediated migration from, say, Spain and Europe, but nowadays, I mean, on average, the population genetics of at least the Mexican Americans, it's about half, right? It's about 50% European, 50% indigenous. That's kind of what I was expecting.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, and I think a better model would be Argentina, where the mitochondrial DNA is about half indigenous, but the overall genome is closer to, say, 15 or 20% indigenous.
Oh, wow.
And Argentina, unlike Mexico, is a nation that kept getting continuous European migration, and that migration was disproportionately male. Because, I mean, if you're going to go across the ocean to work, you're more likely to be a male. It depends on the migration stream. Like, that in New England, it was exceptional because that's one of the few migration streams where like whole families and communities in a really early period migrated. But in most of the New World, including the American South initially, it was mostly just men. And so, when it's mostly men, they need to find partners. They're going to find partners with the local women. But once the first generation of mixed women were born, there's local women. Those local women are already part European, and then they marry another European. So I think Argentina is the model that you would look at to explain the dynamic, which is a correct dynamic that you see of like relative homogeneity and unity of the Y, and then less homogeneity of the mtDNA. I do have to say, though, I don't think we understand the total details of how the north-south migration worked, because I can imagine a scenario where, due to invasions and conquest, population decline on the Yellow River Plain, that it was resettled in part from, say, the Yangtze. During the Tang Dynasty, when China was unified again, the population increased, right? So you can imagine a scenario where there's actually reflux from the south back to the north. And the admixture that I see in North Chinese, I am pretty sure that it comes through Turks and Mongols, that it's not actually mostly Western Eurasians, because the Turks and Mongols, they're about the Mongols in Mongolia are about like 10 to 15% West Eurasian, right? So if you imagine that there are, people who are descended from Mongolic and Tungusic and Turkic people in northern China that were absorbed with the migration north after the reunification during the Tang, and it's just a hypothesis. I'm not saying that's the explanation, but I think that is a plausible model of how you get this definite West Eurasian shift all across the North China Plain, because I see it in a lot of individuals, like definitely Gansu, so it drops off the further east you go, but definitely in Gansu, among the few Wei samples I've seen, there's definitely a minority of West Eurasian Y haplotypes. Yes. R1A, which is often associated with Iranians, J, which is associated with Middle Easterners. So you do have these situations where there's male-mediated migration to northern China, and that's probably nomadic people, some of whom have substantial admixture with West Eurasians. So that's a dynamic that's evident in North China. So when we're saying that, for example, say in Fujian, there is almost zero West Eurasian ancestry in Fujian, right? And so when you're saying Fujian people can be modeled as, a minority of their ancestry, a small minority is indigenous, and then they're mostly Han, and yet the people in the north, they have this 5%, a lot of them have this 5% West Eurasian. So it's not those Han, it's the Han that lived 1,000 to 2,000 years ago, right? So the people in the north themselves have changed somewhat, I believe, due to migrations from the outer fringe of China inward, and also from the south to the north, right?
Right. So I read the report, and I also took a note of the 1 to 5-6% Western Eurasian component, and he talks about mostly in the northwestern China. So we're talking about Gansu, Shanxi, and Shanxi, right? And these are so, I mean, another theory, another conjecture is that there actually have been intrusion of the Western Eurasian peoples into further east historically, like as far back as the early Bronze Age. We now have DNA evidence of them of settlements in Western Mongolia, for example, and also through Chinese historical sources, we know that these people who some say they're Indo-European speaking, they populated the area of what is now is Gansu. So Gansu is not a traditional Han homeland per se until about 2,000 years ago. So 2,000 years ago, the Han Dynasty pushed west and absorbed Gansu from the Xiongnu, who used to populate the region. And so we know that area used to be, it was part of the Great Eurasian steppe, and it received a lot of or nowadays people just call it Silk Road, right? So there has been continuous population exchange along that belt. And so and another side note on the Yuezhi people is that they migrated west, driven away by Xiongnu, or the supposedly ancestor of Hans, and they went through Xinjiang and the area now Central Asia, like area around Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and they went down to conquer Greek cities in Bactria. And eventually they founded the famous Kusan Empire in northern India, Pakistan, that area, and adopted Buddhism. And that's how we got the famous Gandhara arts and with like all these Greek influences. So we know that historically there have been Western Eurasian or Western Eurasian-like people present in northwest China, even before historical times, even before like the Mongol Turkic invasion. So that could explain that mixture, whereas that just doesn't present at all in the southern China. And also another thing about the less variation along the east-west axis. One reason I can think of is the way the Chinese river system runs, because both the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, they run from west to east, and in many ways they function not as a great barrier to human migration rather than as a highway, right? Because it's sometimes a lot easier just to travel on boats. So there has been continuous traffic since ancient times along the rivers. So I mean that could also explain the less population variation along the east-west axis. That's just my 2 cents. So back to the expert.
Yeah, no, that's a definitely like a plausible hypothesis. It could be right. This idea of the early, Indo-European. I mean, it's probably almost certainly Indo-European. Even if these people mixed with Turkic people later, and those were the mediators. It was originally an Indo-European vector. So, in any case, that could be an explanation. So here is my reason for why I'm more skeptical of that than later Turkic and Mongol mediation, and it's because the Turks and the Mongols, these and Tungusic. I mean, all these groups, like we have modern names for them, but like these are all like related groups of people, right? They had multiple periods, like say after the fall of the Han Dynasty, when they occupied the whole of the North China Plain, right? As opposed to just Gansu. So they would have had more of an impact. And the second thing is I don't see, there's almost certainly trace West Eurasian ancestry, but I don't see West Eurasian ancestry in the South Chinese at all, which to me suggests that when the Chinese migrated from the north, they didn't have it. Right. Does that make sense? And so the dynamics that you're talking about are very old. These people were probably in Gansu by the Bronze Age, so they would have been around during the period of the ethnogenesis of the Han from the various Bronze Age cultures. And so, and there is evidence of contact. You're exactly correct. Archaeologically, Christopher Beckwith believes that, in fact, that the Zhao might themselves have been influenced or originally an Indo-European tribe, associated with the Rong and the Di, but that's a minority position. But in any case, there is a fair amount of evidence historically, archaeologically for this contact. My only point is that I don't think that it was very impactful just because I don't see it in the South Chinese because it's so old. It should be present in the Southern Chinese lineages, So I think that it became prominent after 2,000 years ago because I think that the South Chinese, much of South China was settled from the north before this admixture. So that's the one thing that I would say in relation to that. I do think, your hypothesis about the rivers, I mean, to me, that's easily the most viable explanation why there's east-west migration and also like even if there wasn't a famine, I also think like the rivers allow continuous gene flow,
Yes.
so that there's marriage networks that are up and down the river valleys, and so this reduces the variation between the different components. And I mean that's the key. Like when you have marriage networks between populations, their genetic distance is going to decrease, and it's not going to increase at all. And so you could have a situation where all of Han speaking, Chinese speaking, China. I mean, it sounds weird to say it that way, but Chinese speaking China is an integrated marriage network. And so it's keeping it from diverging very far. So when you look at some of the ethnic minority groups, a few of the ones in central China, like the Yi and the Tuzia, I don't know how to pronounce it, the Shi, they're not that different than the Han. They probably intermarried with the Han and they contributed to the Han. But they tend to be different partly because they're more endogamous. They have a smaller marriage network group, and so they're starting to drift apart,
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the dynamics that you see. So that's what I would say to that.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. All right. Okay, we can continue on. This is fascinating, by the way. I mean, this is like catnip for me. So, in fact, one of the puzzle for me, because I just started a new podcast series on the Chinese history. I started from the prehistory, the dawn of agriculture, and as I was talking about it, it got me thinking, right? Because like there were multiple population centers in China in the Neolithic time, and with very different peoples. I mean, we have the ancient DNA now. We tested for them from around 5,000 years ago, and at that time there was significant difference, say between people of the northern China Plain in Yellow River Basin versus Yangtze River Valley. But the amazing fact that is that somehow that difference disappear, right? Like over time. Of course, China has a lot longer history of being like part of this part of a centralized empire. So I think that probably helped with the population flow. Certainly made the ease of travel among different parts of the empire, and especially when the government officials, because in China it's mandated that the Mandarin official who passes the imperial test, they cannot serve in their own locality. That was done intentionally to prevent like entrenchment of local interest. So if like a son of local gentry who passed the imperial exam and became an imperial official, he has to serve in a different part of China, and think that definitely also helped to mix population around a little bit. Razib?
Yeah. So one thing that I have said before is that the Chinese people may have been created by the Chinese Empire. Right. So one of the dynamics that that I was alluding to here is the demographic expansion out of these agricultural hearths. That's a real thing. China used to probably have a lot more population structure in prehistory. Some of this is recorded and alluded to in the writings, and we have some evidence now from ancient DNA that you're alluding to. And so you have this demographic expansion and like rapid replacement of other groups or assimilation. So this is what you see in the Y chromosome. The other dynamic, which you're just alluding to, is the fact that China had a bureaucratic cultural system, a state system that spanned this huge geography that integrated different populations together. So you were talking about the lower Yangtze Valley and the Yellow River Valley as like the two hearths. We know that, probably the Yellow River Valley is the origins of what we consider Chinese, qua-Chinese culture, right? But the Yangtze Valley might have contributed something demographically insofar as if the two integrate into we call it panmictic in population genetics, randomly mating. It doesn't have to be totally randomly mating, but if they integrate enough, they create a common population that then expands. You can't differentiate the signal too much, right? So you can imagine a situation where males from, say, the Shang dynasty period mixed with these people in the Yangtze, and so there's a lot of mixture, and the Y chromosome is mostly from the Shang dynasty period, from that upper, the Yellow River area, but the whole genome could be mixed around in diverse ways. And then there was a later demographic expansion And the local differentiation and the local tribes that were assimilated were kind of erased partly just through these marriage networks that you're talking about. And so it's actually like it's not quite Rube Goldberg, but it's a machine with multiple different parts creating and enforcing homogenization. And one of the global dynamics that we have seen over the last 10 years of ancient DNA is the last 10,000 years have actually seen a lot of admixture and homogenization, probably driven by the emergence of meta-ethnic identities, so identities that are pan-tribal, also trade, the use of horse to migrate. These things have like homogenized large swaths of Eurasia to a much greater extent than they were probably during the Pleistocene. Right. And this includes China.
Very interesting factoids I picked up from the report you sent me was that the comparison between China and Europe, because Europe has been extensively studied, the European genetics. I follow your blog and the Eurasian blog, and that we know today modern Europeans can be roughly modeled as convergence of three populations: the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the Neolithic farmers migrating from Middle East or Near East, specifically Anatolia, and then a further population that moving from like the steppe, right? Some people call it the Indo-European component. And what is interesting is that compared with China, of course, there's large genetic distance between the European and the Chinese, but among the three source population for the Europeans, that the Chinese are closer to the Metholithic hunter-gatherers of old Europe than say the newcomers and the Neolithic farmers that moved in from Middle East or the other component. Go ahead.
Yeah. There's some subtleties here. Definitely, the Chinese are most distant from the Neolithic farmers. There is evidence of actually like really, really ancient contact between the ancestors of West Eurasians and East Eurasians, and I'm saying the ancestors because we don't know where these people were, but there is evidence of like even Pleistocene contacts. There's evidence of it looks like some sort of gene flow from a population related to modern East Eurasians, of which the Han Chinese are the most representative and largest group, into Mesolithic Europe within, say, like the last 15,000 years. In terms of the Indo-European steppe component, that's a little more complicated. I'm not sure if that's necessarily correct, that they're more distant than the Western hunter-gatherers. And part of the issue here is it looks like there is some evidence of ancient North Eurasian, which is a very distant, like Paleo-Siberian group, as you know, that contributed a fair amount to the early Indo-Europeans. It's deeply diverged from the Western hunter-gatherers, but so like let's say like 40,000 years ago, like just only a little bit after the East Eurasians diverged from the Western Eurasians. This group seems to have contributed a substantial amount to the Indo-Europeans, as you know, but there is evidence which hasn't been like published, but it's in the supplements of some of these papers, that there was gene flow into northern East Asia, into like say where the Yellow River, Valley, Mongolia, these areas, from these Paleo-Siberians that is causing some affinity there. So, for your listeners, this is getting into the weeds and it's complicated. And part of the issue is the terms that we use today don't mean nearly as much in the past, because the past is it's like if you consider like modern populations threading together different lineages, and those lineages themselves are threaded together and bifurcated from other lineages. Imagine like the threads coming together and coming apart, coming together and coming apart, and like they're all ultimately like the same thread that goes back to out of Africa, but the fabrics that come together are totally different with different patterns, right? And so, you got to be careful about the terminology. I mean, should we get to Tianyun, the 40,000-year-old sample?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is some ancient DNA with mtDNA and other things from like Bronze Age China, which indicates that I think like the term is the Erilitu culture. Did you talk about that?
Sorry, the what culture?
The Erilitau culture, it's in like it's basically in Henan, Shaanxi, Henan, And it's the culture before the Shang Dynasty. Okay, it's prehistoric. We don't know about it, and so there is some DNA from that culture. It looks like those people are similar to like later Chinese, at least in their Y and the MT DNA. So it's not like new people came in and became Chinese. Because in Europe and India, you see massive turnover during the Bronze Age. It doesn't look like China was quite like that, at least the North China Plain. It looks like agriculture. It looks like agriculture started indigenously, and there was demographic expansion from these agricultural groups. So China is as if Neolithic farmers had not been overwhelmed by Indo-Europeans. That's one way you could imagine it, right? Indo-Europeans were obviously on the edge of China, but they didn't demographically overwhelm it, and they barely, I believe they barely impacted it until later, which is through the Mongols. But that was an earlier conversation. So we have that dynamic going. Tianyun is a sample from Tianyun Cave. It's kind of from like north central China, I think. And this is the most ancient genome we have from East Eurasia. There's huge lacunae, huge gaps of Chinese ancient DNA. Kyomi Fu is trying to work on this. I think she's a Fudan, if I remember off the top of my head. And it just hasn't been published. I don't know what's going on, but I will tell you that Tianyun, you can already see that this individual is more closely related to East Eurasian and Native American peoples 40,000 years ago. What that is telling you is the people of East Eurasia and West Eurasia, they separated more than 40,000 years ago, which we kind of knew. And, the interesting thing is this Tianyun individual is probably not the ancestor of modern Chinese, but it's definitely related predominantly to the ancestor of modern Chinese, if that makes sense. It's probably like a sister lineage to proto-modern Chinese. So that means that like there has been a pretty deep continuity in China going back to the first settlement, which is in contrast to Europe, where there have been multiple replacements. And South Asia, where there's been a lot of admixture of different populations, and Southeast Asia, which was settled from what is today southern China within the last 4,000 years, and the native peoples have been totally replaced, right? Or in Africa, where the Bantu expansion has totally reshaped the continent south of the Sahara within the last 4,000 years. So, we don't have enough DNA to make definitive conclusions, but it does look like the Tianyun individual is not that different from modern. I mean, it is quite different from modern Chinese because it's like 40,000 years ago, right? But it looks like, compared to all the other ancient DNA that we have from a contemporary time period, it's the best candidate to be ancestral to modern East Eurasians, which makes sense because it's in China, right? And so, I mean, this is suggesting that if you just look at geography, when modern humans left Africa or the fringe of the Near East, and they expanded, they separated into two streams. One that went kind of like north into Siberia and western and into Europe along like the fringes and stayed in the Near East, and then another that continued through South Asia, probably split south, became Oceanians very early on, probably like around like 45 to 50,000 or years or earlier, split into the southern stream and the northern stream. The northern stream went into China. Eventually, some of these people mixed with Paleo-Siberians and moved into the New World, as we know, right? But so you have like these early deep differentiations across Eurasia that are defined by geography, right? So like the ancestry of people in Papua and Australia, the indigenous people, is closer to that of China than it is to Europeans or Middle Easterners, because they are part of the stream that kept going eastward into Eurasia. The ancestry of people in South Asia that's not related to West Eurasians, that probably likely indigenous component, is more closely related to the people in China than it is to the people in Europe, because it's part of the Eastern push. And in a way, like, I mean, everybody in Australia and China and the New World, like, they have ancestors that had to go through India. That's just how it happened, probably. And so, like, these are like very deep divergences, but they show like kind of the migration out of Africa, period. In some areas, like in India, there was like reflux and other things going on, whereas like West Eurasians went in and mixed and changed everything a lot. So India is like a transition, and actually it's more like average Indian is a little bit more shifted to West Eurasians now than East Eurasians, but 10,000 years ago, it would have been the other way around. They'd be more shifted towards East Eurasians, right? And in Europe, you have populations that are more similar to East Eurasians than they would have been, 20 or 30,000 years ago. And then you have like weird things that we don't really understand. So there's a sample from like 35,000 years ago from a cave, I think in France. And unlike every other early Pleistocene individual, that individual shows shared ancestry with Tianyun.
Wow.
Right? And nobody knows why. Like, here's my hypothesis for why that could be. It could be that even in the Near East, the different tribes were already separating into different groups, and some of them went north and west, some of them went east, and it wasn't like a vast amalgamated, differentiated horde. And so one of the ones that went west had some mixture from a tribe that went east.
And
does that make sense?
Yes, and I was just thinking also, a lot of times when the human migration is modeled as simply one pulse or like unidirectional flow, but in actual history is a lot more messier because humans move in all directions. Sometimes they move east and sometimes they move back, and people just circulate wherever they find food, shelter, and what better hunting ground. So they're not necessarily just always going one direction. We know there's backflow back into Africa, for example, right? And I'm sure there are also same with people wandering east and then coming back west, going through Central Asia to Europe maybe, and then so there's all kind of mixture that's happening, and that we're just finding out right now through the sampling of various ancient DNA.
Yeah, and one thing I would say is the less ancient DNA you have, the more likely your model is to miss major features. And we just know this from Europe because we have a lot of ancient DNA. In the initial period, the models were coarse and they weren't, they were in the right direction, but they were so incomplete that they led to like just spurious conclusions. And so as we have more ancient DNA in East Asia and South Asia, we will understand a lot more about the details of what happened. So I will say, for example, that we have a lot of ancient DNA from Southeast Asia for various reasons. The indigenous people of Southeast Asia are, I think the Habanian culture or something. Anyway, like they were like the hunter-gatherers, right? The only people who are like the pure representatives of those people or similar to them are probably the people of the Andaman Islands. Like even the people of the Philippines that are indigenous, they call them Negritos, have mixed with the Austronesians. So all of this like change happened in the last 5,000 years with rice farmers, with the Austroasiatics probably coming from the highlands of Yunnan, that area, and then the Austronesians were probably more from Taiwan, and then you have other people with like different relationships like the Thai that came during historical period. All of these migrations southward, you can say that most Southeast Asians are like maybe like the Indonesians would be like 25% descended from these Australo-Melanesian, which is just like a made-up term, but it's basically like Pleistocene hunter-gatherer people, and 75% farmer. The Vietnamese is more farmer, less Australo-Melanesian, in part because there was Chinese migration into Vietnam. And then Cambodians probably like the most Australo-Melanesian, just for various reasons. Anyway, so there's stuff like that, and then there's also later Indian migration, which confuses it. I'm not going to get into that. But you have this dynamic.
I'm in Bali right now, but I am going to get into that a little bit. Okay. I'm in Bali right now, and it's very obvious to me, just visually, how much Indian influence is in Southeast Asia. I mean, both in terms of religion, culture, and even people. I can see it in the faces of people.
Yeah, I mean, until recently, in the scholarly literature, it had been claimed that the Indianization of Southeast Asia was a matter of just cultural diffusion, and that there wasn't much of a demographic impact. I've looked pretty closely at the data, and it's pretty obvious that the demographic impact in many areas was pretty significant. And I'm talking about, say, like in Cambodia, where, that's pretty far from India. Like, we're not talking like Malaysia, which had a lot of colonial Indians coming, or Myanmar, Burma, which was close enough to the Bay of Bengal that you could imagine migration. Cambodia, there has been no colonial evidence of Indians. But for example, Indian R1A lineage is found at 5-10% in Cambodia. So that's giving you a general sense that it's not 1%, it's closer to 10% in a lot of Southeast Asia. And I mean, that's not insignificant. It's much higher than, except for maybe outside of Thailand, it's much higher than Chinese ancestry in the indigenous people, because Chinese ancestry has been relatively late, except with the exception probably of Vietnam, right? And so you have these complicated mixes, and we're just describing them verbally. But I brought this up because if you look at the most ancient of the Austroasiatic people who did not mix with the indigenous Australo-Melanesians, it looks like they themselves are a compound of mixtures of very differentiated people in the highlands of South China. So there are records of dark-skinned people apparently in Yunnan and other areas. So it looks like modern China in a way has homogenized and transformed the diversity of ancient China in certain ways that we probably will only get a sense of with ancient DNA. It looks like, say, the Dai people of China they don't have Australo-Melanesian ancestry really, but it doesn't look like they are just like North Chinese. Like they have something that's deeply diverged, just like North Chinese themselves probably have Paleo-Siberian and this West Eurasian ancestry. So, East Eurasians, they're pretty homogenous, I think partly just because of like the marriage networks and the Chinese bureaucratic state. But if you dig deeper and as we get more and more ancient DNA, you're going to see the threads coming apart into these distinct peoples, and probably we will be able to identify particular peoples in the Chinese historical record with these population genetic clusters, which, thank God we have a pretty detailed histories from the Chinese themselves, unlike some other people. Like in South Asia, we're going blind. We have the epics and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Vedas, but we don't have physical records. We can't we can't translate the Indus Valley script. So I'm very optimistic. I'm very excited. I'm going to be entirely frank and say that I think one of the reasons we don't have DNA from ancient China right now is some sort of weird political consideration. I don't think it's a straightforward thing where it's like, oh, they're going to show that the Chinese were totally different. I don't think that's what it is. I think they're trying to figure out how to spin it. Okay, I'm going to be entirely honest. And I think they don't know how. I think they must be sitting, because we have lots of ancient DNA from Southeast Asia. If we have lots of ancient DNA from Southeast Asia, why don't we have it from China? It's even warm. It's even cooler.
Actually, Fudan University in particular has been singled out, I know, on Chinese social media because people are saying, why you guys spend all your time doing frivolous research, like trying to figure out who are the modern descendant of the Three Kingdoms warlord Cao Cao, then trying to figure out the more interesting stuff like the deep the Chinese ancient population structures, right? But at one hand, it's understandable that they're doing it as kind of like a population, like a publicity stunt, because everybody's interested in Three Kingdoms in China, and Cao Cao is very popular. But at the same time, you bring a very valid question. China has a large population of these population geneticists, and China has a large, they can conduct large sampling size tests, and we have yet to see the kind of detailed reports that we have from Europe, or even from Southeast Asia.
I point out Southeast Asia because the scientific infrastructure there is weaker, and ancient DNA should actually preserve less well. So the lack of results in China is a result in and of itself that is trying to tell you something, and I don't think it's something scientific.
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, we're seeing now slowly more and more reports coming out, and I do hope we can see more in the future. But I want to take this opportunity also to point it out, to debunk some old theories. So like you pointed out, the Tianyuan man, which is found in the Tianyuan cave near Beijing, is related to modern East Asians and as well as Native Americans. And so back when my grandpa was growing up, right? So that would be like the 1920s. Back then, because the influence of the Western archaeology and also the popularity of the Aryan invasion theory, what they were taught in school back then, and my grandfather was a teacher, so what he actually also taught in school is that the civilization originally came from the West to China, from Middle East, from the Fertile Crescent, agriculture, and then chariots spread to China because Song Dynasty, which is the first dynasty in China we have archaeological evidence for, they were known for their use of chariots, right? So the reasoning is, well, chariot, people don't reinvent the wheel, right? So chariot was first rose in the West, so it must come through to China through the Silk Road, and then by extension, people were making some crazy theory that the Song rulers were themselves, some kind of Indo-European people from the West, and they, brought this new culture into China, right? Because Song Dynasty was a very well-developed bronze culture, right? Which is kind of a shift from the previous archaeological finds that we have. Like there's now still a huge controversy around the Chinese recorded Chinese dynasty before the Song Dynasty, because in the Chinese history book we're told the history started with the Xia dynasty and then it was replaced by the Song. But we right now there's a lot of a controversy on the archaeological evidence for Xia dynasty, right? What we do have is we have the Song dynasty ruins, and based on Song dynasty ruins, it has very well-developed bronze culture. We had chariots. And so back in the 1920s, people, especially a lot of Western archaeologists was proposing this idea that, the Chinese civilization came from outside. It came from West Asia, Western Eurasia. Back then, I don't think they even talk about the Indo-European genesis in the steppe. I mean, they were still thinking like everything come from Middle East, from the Fertile Crescent, right? And that idea still lingers on. There's still some people, even in China, says, "Oh yeah, you subscribe to the idea that maybe the Song culture came from the West." But from the most recent genetic studies that we know from all the Song human remains, that they are just Chinese. We don't have much evidence of, like, say, a Western Eurasian intrusion, around that time. So I just like to point that out. That phone. Go ahead.
Well, so I will differentiate between certain things. So there's cultural diffusion where you take a cultural package in totality and transplant it, and it's brought by people. So I do think the Indo-Aryans came into South Asia. They brought their language. They brought their horse cult. They brought their mythology. They brought their chariots, all from the steppe in totality, right? On the other hand, I do think it's highly plausible, and from what I know, probable, that some elements of chariot design and manufacture spread into China from Central Asia, just like it spread into the Middle East and it spread into Europe. And this could be some, artisans, a few people, but really it's more of, you see a cultural artifact that is so useful that you copy it or you imitate it immediately. So by analogy, think about the gun. Japan, before the Tokugawa, had a massive gun manufacturing industry because they saw how useful the gun was. And so it's not like Europeans migrated to Japan and they were making all the guns. It was the Japanese immediately saw the gun. They figured out the engineering really quickly. It wasn't that difficult. So we know in ancient Egypt that the earliest form of writing and certain types of architecture look like to have been influenced by Mesopotamian motifs, but they quickly went in their own direction. And it wasn't that they actually even copied Mesopotamia as much as they were triggered by the idea of writing or the idea of particular types of monumental architecture, and then they did their own form. I think the Chinese might, in the early period at least, be evidence of the latter in certain cases. So I think chariots are probably the best case. I'm not sure about writing, because writing, we know, was invented independently by the Maya, that are not in the old world at all, right? So we know that like this sort of like notation could emerge independently. I think that's a case where I'm not sure. With the we have the oracle bones and other things, and like it's not like the Central Asians came with literacy, right? But with the chariots, that's one case where it looks like it was such a good invention. It spread rapidly without people. We know this happened with certain types of bows that spread to the New World actually 1,500 years ago before Columbus. But it seems like they went across up through Siberia, and they didn't spread too much with people, like a little bit, but bows spread all across the New World, just because like there's certain types of bows that were much better and all this stuff. So I think that influence is real. I think there is some connection to the West, but demographically, I don't think the West Eurasian impact between, say, I don't know, the Pleistocene, like who knows what happened with the Paleo-Siberians, like that's a different issue, it's a whole different landscape. But during the Holocene, after the Ice Age, the Western impact in China, I think, predominantly dates to the period after the fall of the Han Dynasty and up to the Mongol period, probably mostly the Dong to the Mongol period. There was interactions with people, like we know a lot of Sogdians arrived during the Dong Dynasty, right?
Yeah.
Like we know there are a lot of Sogdians, right? And so like that's one group. We know that the Mongols brought a ton of Central Asians. A lot of these are Turkic, and these Turkic people themselves are admixed with West Asians, but some of them are Persians or Iranians, and so they would bring West Eurasian ancestry. So I think most of that is during that period, but I think the cultural impact could be earlier. I think some of it almost certainly is earlier, and it's because we know that there's these like Central Asian nomadic groups that moved across the steppe from China all the way into the Pannonian Plain, Hungary, very rapidly over a generation. And they kind of had this like international, it's like they had a maritime confederacy on the edges of the steppe where they became more fertile. So the Scythians, we see the Scythians going from, the Volga steppe all the way east into Mongolia. And as they went east, they mixed with the native like Tungusic, Altaic people, and they became more East Asian. And some of these Scythians went back west.
Right.
And so they brought some of the East Asian with them, right? And so I think we can imagine a scenario with the chariot in particular where the Shang might have been influenced by the ancestors of the Wuxia that you were talking about in Gansu.
Yes.
And they might have imitated, just like the Native Americans took to the horse almost immediately when the Spanish showed up.
Yep.
I mean, you see the horse and you're like, okay, like, get on that and, like, drive your enemies before you. That's just, like, light bulb, right? And so you can imagine a situation where that happened. And so you see, like, okay, it has Chinese characteristics, but this is like a Western chariot with Chinese characteristics, right? On the other hand, genetically and linguistically, and in terms of, say, their religion, they can be totally indigenous, which they seem to be.
Yes. I mean, I'm not arguing for independent invention of chariot in China itself. I think the Gang example you use is probably a very close model because, the Portuguese did travel to Japan and, when the Japanese saw the Portuguese handling the arquebus, they were very impressed. So they immediately bought some guns and then start to reverse engineer them and then quickly, making even better guns themselves. So I think that's a much more plausible model because, as we now know, there's no large scale population replacement, not anywhere the scale that was happening in Europe or South Asia, and I'm still gonna stick to my theory about the long-standing linkage through the Silk Road because that 5-6% Western Eurasian structure that was found in northern Chinese was primarily. I look at the report. It was primarily northwest China, not the entire northern China, but Gansu, Shanxi, and Shanxi. So all the three provinces that was shifted toward the west. Right, and like a Mongol, because Mongol took over all of China, and you would think that distribution would be more uniform, say, across the entire northern China plains, because Mongol didn't just come through Gansu or Shanxi. They came through Beijing, they came through Hebei, they came through Shandong. They were everywhere, and so I still think that that Western Eurasian component was not necessarily just from like one pulse, right? Like it was probably, there was contact from like way earlier, from early Bronze Age, but it kind of continued, and persisted into historical times, into Tang Dynasty with the Sogdians, and reinforced with the Mongols and Turkic conquerors.
All right, I don't want to litigate this too further, because like I think like your listeners are going to be like, why are they arguing about this? Because like this is narcissism of small differences. But from what I've seen, the Y chromosomes tend to be R1A, which is more associated with Iranian peoples, and R1B is associated with the older Tocharian type peoples. So we don't know if they usually were like Iranian or Tocharian or like admixed with those people, and they were actually Altaic. Who knows? I mean, probably they were more Iranian actually, but if there were more of the steppe people really early on, I would expect to see more R1B than I think I do, but I don't have enough data because like it's going to be a small number of samples anyways, because it's not very much admixture anyway. So that is how you would evaluate that question, because the really old stuff seems to have been in R1B males, that paternal lineage, and the Iranians are the ones who brought R1A. In the Mongols, I tend to see R1A, which indicates that they had interaction with Scythians, Iranian steppe nomads, right? And in the Tarim Basin, you see both R1A and R1B, and the R1B is probably due to earlier Tocharian migration that was as early as 5,000 years ago. So that was a really long time ago. And then you see R1A, and the southern Tarim Basin was populated by Iranian tribes. Like so I think like Hotan was Iranian. It was Saka Iranian, and then you have and Turfan was still Tocharian. So it's like you have this like complicated. We will know the answer soon. I do believe that's true.
Oh, I'm not saying that the Gansu component was from the ancient the Tocharians. I was saying it's not from a single pulse, right? It's a continuous, because there were Tocharians, there's Scythians, later there were Turco-Mongols, there were Sogdians, right? There's these Persian Arab merchants coming through. I mean, it's a continuous reinforcement. That's why there was that persistent 5%. That is just my 2 cents. I'm just throwing it out there, but I defer to your expertise.
No. I mean, we'll figure it out. I mean, ultimately, what do the data say, right? So, I mean, that's where we're at. It's a great position to be at. It's a great time to be interested in the topic. And Leibniz, William Gottfried Leibniz used to say that like someday we'll have a computer, and instead of having arguments and like going back and forth, we can just say, "Let us calculate." And we're coming close to that. We're coming close to that stage in population genetics. Like when people say, "Well, like South Chinese are more like Vietnamese," I just say, let us calculate and see what the PCA says. I'll just pull up my data sets and like run it. Or I'll run model-based clustering. I'll do various things to test these hypotheses that people present, and then I'll present the plots and say, this is what the plots say. That's it. That's the stage we're at.
Yes. So any concluding thoughts?
The concluding thought is probably what I started out with. I was surprised how little structure there is in China among the Han Chinese. I suspect that it's a combination of factors of ancient demographic expansion, the imperial period of just like mixing between different provinces, and then also metapopulation dynamics where you have like famines and places were repopulated from other provinces. So I think that's the explanation, which is multiple different things going on. In terms of Other things which we didn't talk about because I think it's like outside the purview of this, physical characteristics I think probably have changed somewhat too due to selection. We know natural selection is continuing in many populations. So things like the epicanthic fold, which is associated with northern Chinese in particular, and lesser extent southern, dry earwax, other things like that look like they've been under selection since the Pleistocene. They may have increased in frequency. Chinese probably have gotten lighter skinned over time. We don't really know why. It could be sexual selection. It could be something else. So one of the things that I think we'll find out is that during the Pleistocene, even though the people in the region of modern China are mostly descended from those people, they might have looked very different. They might have looked more like the Ainu. I think the Ainu might be what East Asians looked more like, and there's been like recent changes. We don't know why. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to investigate. Also, I have mentioned to people the fact that China has much greater diversity of flora and fauna, I mean, especially flora, than Europe. And one of the reasons why is that the ice sheets in Europe were occupying so much the tundra, basically, and the ice sheets were occupying more than there was like fewer refuges because the Mediterranean was to the south, blocking them. China had more geographic depth. I mean, in military terms, you say strategic depth, where it's like, the ecosystems retreated to southern China, and then they expanded. So it was like north-south expansion, and there's more preservation of the biodiversity. I wonder if that's also true of the people, where it doesn't look like there's extreme bottlenecks in China in the Pleistocene as occurred with European Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, where there's just like lots of extinction constantly. I think in China you might have a situation where if it got too cold, the people on the northern fringe died, but the people on the southern fringe didn't, and there was a southern fringe. There was no Mediterranean Sea to the south. Like there's a vast expanse of, all the way out to the Pearl River Delta, which was probably, more temperate, deciduous back then, but it certainly wasn't ice cold, So I think one of the things in the future that we will see for Pleistocene ancient DNA is that China, one of the reasons there's more continuity in China than Europe is China had a larger base population of hunter-gatherers because it's more geographically diverse and more ecologically buffered from the inclement conditions of the Ice Age, especially the dry, cold spells. So that was my prediction. That was my prediction. You heard it here first.
Okay, here you have it, folks. I'm very, as I said, I'm very excited for the continuing new results coming out. I mean, before most of the genetic studies are pretty European centers. That's just because that's where we have the best data, and that's where the geneticists have been focused their efforts on. And now we're finally starting to see. That effort is being devoted elsewhere, right? Like all these Chinese data coming out, all these data from the rest of the world. I'm very excited, and I mean, I'm just this is for me this is catnip, and I can geek on this for hours.
Well, you know what they say: seek knowledge even unto China.
Okay, I think that's with that hadith. I think that's a good point to wrap it up. Thank you again, Razib, for coming onto the show, and we would like to have you back in the future to talk about any new developments or just anything that you might find interesting, because I find you a very interesting person and very knowledgeable to talk to. So we can just like
for sure, man.
Whoever you want, we can just get a geek out going.
Well, I mean, next time there is when the ancient DNA finally gets published, let's do a part 2.
Excellent, great suggestion. Yeah. Definitely.
All right. Take it easy, man.
Okay. Thank you very much, Razib.
Bye.
So everybody, that's Razib Khan, a geneticist and a polymath. I will put his blog and podcast in the show notes. And thank you again for listening.